In this world, there's lots of things that we can't depend on, but one of the things I always could depend on was this Hoover Model 51 vacuum cleaner sitting in my basement and collecting dust for the past 3 years. 3 years ago, I restored and cleaned out the inside, but then I never wanted to use it after that because I didn't have any way to use disposable bags with it. And I mean, it was missing nearly all of the attachments too, which didn't help, but that's forgivable because at least that doesn't shoot fine dust all over the house. At the time of recording this, I decided that I finally wanted to use this vacuum in the house. But there were a few things I wanted to address before doing this, including making it able to use disposable bags. So join me as we give this old vacuum some upgrades and see what it's really capable of. What I wanted to tackle first was the lack of disposable bag situation, because that's ultimately what prevented me from wanting to use the vacuum in the first place. I took a look through some bags to get an idea for which one I wanted to use. One of my original ideas was to take a larger bag, like this Kirby one, and cut it to fit in the dustbin of the vacuum. Unfortunately, this would be a pain to empty the bag, so the idea never got put into action. So I continued my search for the perfect bag. But this remained a thought in the back of my head as a fallback plan, just in case. These bags I used in my Electrolux Model G actually looked pretty promising, so let's hold that up to the Hoover and see if it agrees. And sure enough, that won't work. The bag is sealed almost right up to the edge of the cardboard, which would make it almost impossible to cut the cardboard to fit in the Hoover. So the search continues. But not too far off, this HEPA variant of the same Electrolux Type C bag seems like it might be more feasible, since the bag is glued to the cardboard, which is much closer to the center. And there we go, looks like this one's a winner. Next, I brought the vacuum to my work desk and gave it a quick wipe down. It was already pretty clean since I restored it in the last 3 years and stored it in its box, so there was only a small bit of dust. Nothing compared to what I'm used to seeing on these old machines. So I opened the dustbin to see what I'm up against, and I got the idea to try to make an insert that fits in between the door and the dustbin, pretty similar to ones I've made in the past for Hoover upright vacuums. So I took to Google SketchUp 8, my very primitive go-to for 3D modeling, and started with a really simple design that would just fit around the door seal, just to see if my design will actually work. And this way I don't waste loads of filament on something that might not even be feasible. And I did have a pretty strong suspicion that this design might have some flaws, but we'll see if they actually prevent me from using the design or if I can roll with it. After taking it over to the slicer and the printer, everything's looking pretty good, so it's time to see if it will actually fit on the vacuum and allow the door to shut. It fits on the door pretty well, nearly perfectly, but unfortunately the door wouldn't even think about shutting, so that leaves this design entirely off the table. Oh well, back to the drawing board. The next design I thought of was something that would stick around the opening with double-sided tape as a gasket, and that would hold the bag in place and reroute the dirt into it. So, going back to Google SketchUp, let's give this design a try. The vacuum's design itself doesn't leave much room for other possibilities, so if this doesn't work, I'm not really sure what I'll do, but we'll think about that later if we have to. So far, the design is coming out kind of bulky, but that's fine. We'll clean it up later if it ends up working. Going over to the slicer, everything is looking pretty good and ready to go. Lots of supports on this one, so I had to be pretty careful not to do anything that would make them difficult to remove. And almost 8 hours later, the print is finished. It looks better than I expected. Well, no, that's a lie. It looks about the same as I expected because it had a preview, but I'm still glad it finished, so let's see if this one fits. It fits on the lid, so that's promising. Not that the last one didn't, but this is about what it would look like while it's mounted, and you can already see there might be some issues. But putting those suspicions aside for now, let's see if the bag fits. And sure enough, it fits perfectly. So that's another thing this design has right so far. I'll need to cut the bag's cardboard to size later on, but we'll get to that in a bit. I taped the adapter to the lid and attempted to put it on the vacuum, and yet again, my suspicion was correct. The lid doesn't shut. But it at least isn't hopeless this time. I can tweak this design just a bit to reduce its size. And thanks to the magic of video editing, we have another revision. And this one has a shorter neck than the second, so it doesn't reach down as far, which should just be enough to clear the dustbin when closing. And just like last time, I applied some tape to hold the adapter in place, connected the dustbin hinge, and It worked! It's still a bit bulky, but now I have a starting point. And better yet, worst case scenario, this one will fit on the vacuum, so even if the next revision doesn't work out, I still have something to fall back on. So this is looking promising. The next thing I wanted to take care of was cutting the bag to size. To make this easier, I made a stencil based on the bag adapter dimensions, which just uses the bag's edges and center hole to stay in place. This way, I can just trace where I need to cut, so there isn't any guesswork. Cutting itself proved to be a lot more challenging than I expected, and the only reason for this is because I needed to cut so close to where the bag was glued. I could have easily cut into the bag while cutting these lines, but thankfully I didn't. I think a new revision of this is warranted, but I'll keep going with this one for now just so I can have something to test. And there we go! Now that the bag's all cut, with barely enough clearance between the cut lines and the glue, we can try attaching it to the adapter. And, as expected, this one fit fine. I tried to fit the whole thing in the vacuum again just to see how it would fit, and as expected, it fits pretty well. It's a good thing these Model G bags were sized so perfectly to fit in here. The next test I want to do is actually to run the vacuum and make sure the bag holds in place, just in case something moves around like it shouldn't. I don't think it should, but you can never be too certain. And looks like we're good to go. After that success, I wanted to address the edge clearance. I think the best way I can go about this is to shape the plates that come in contact with the bag's cardboard a little bit differently. And once again, thanks to the magic of editing, a new revision is out and ready to be tested. This one isn't much different from the previous one, except the bag is now cut in an octagonal shape as opposed to square. This is so the corners didn't get as close to the edge of the dustbin, and so I could cut further away from the bag's glue. This also made cutting go much more easily, as I didn't have to worry about cutting into the bag by accident. Still, I took my time, because I didn't want the cuts to be messy. After that, I tried fitting the bag on the new adapter, and it fit just as well as the earlier revision. And, as expected, everything still fits in the vacuum, and the corners are much further away from the dustbin now. Not that it was a terrible concern before, but it's always nice to give things plenty of clearance. The last part to this bag adapter is getting it to adhere to the lid, which I plan to do using thick double-sided tape. And to do this, I used the bottom of the 3D model as a path for my laser cutter to follow. It took me a few tries to cut the material all the way through, as this was my first time cutting this material on the machine. Unfortunately, in doing this, it just melted the material too much, so I couldn't even peel it away to reveal the adhesive. So, to get around this, I just etched it lightly so I could use it as a stencil. Once that was done, it was time to cut it with a utility knife. This wasn't too difficult, and the lines really didn't have to be perfect. No one's going to be looking in the bag chamber regularly anyway. Well, except me, maybe. I figured it was about time to start prepping the surfaces where the adhesive would touch. To do this, I used 91% isopropyl alcohol on both surfaces. I attached the adhesive to the 3D printed part first, because that would make it easier to position the lid, and then I lined up the adapter and pressed it into place. About this moment is when I tried to tug on it, and that's not good. I've had problems with things sticking to prints before, so this didn't really surprise me that much, so I guess I just need to look for a solution to that problem. And this turned out to be a pretty good opportunity to see how difficult the adapter is to remove from the vacuum if its presence is no longer desired. The adhesive stuck really well to the lid, so that was good to know that the 3D print adhesion was likely the only point of failure. I decided to solve this problem by applying some silicone RTV between the 3D printed part and the double-sided tape. That way it would get some extra help. This would also serve the dual purpose of filling any ridges on the surface of the print. Surprisingly, the RTV made the double-sided tape easier to apply, because I could just move it around slightly after pressing it down. While I waited for that to dry, I removed any remaining sticky residue from the lid that the previous seal left. The isopropyl alcohol did its job pretty well at removing that, but it still took a lot longer than I anticipated. I let the RTV dry for a few days, and now it's ready. We can finally stick it under the vacuum and have a functioning bag adapter. I felt the pressure was on this time, because I really didn't want to repeat this process again. I was hesitant at first to test the strength once this was finished, but I soon realized that this thing really isn't going anywhere. The RTV was definitely the missing puzzle piece. Now, just to apply the bag, and this vacuum is now ready to keep the air a lot cleaner. Now that the biggest concern is out of the way, the next thing I plan to take care of are the metal rails that the vacuum sits on. And these are nice for sliding on carpet, but most of my house is hardwood and I'd not like to add more scratches to it. So, to solve this, I'm going to design something to hold these sticky felt pads. Heading over to SketchUp, I whipped up a quick design that I could use to test. There isn't much to go wrong here, but I started with just printing one so I can tweak it to grab the rail a little looser or tighter if needed. The first revision came out okay, but it's a little loose, so I tweaked the model a bit and now it fits perfectly. Assembling these is pretty easy. You just take the felt pad and stick it on the 3D printed part, and then do that 3 more times. Now it's time to try these out on the floor, and it seems like they work pretty well, or that's what I thought at first, until I tried to actually use the vacuum. They rotate a little bit too easily, which completely defeats their purpose. So I went back to Google SketchUp to make the design a little bit wider, since all I really needed to do is make sure that they can't rotate easily when the vacuum is flat on the ground. And everything was looking pretty good on the slicer, and since I already had the measurements from the first design, I was pretty certain this would fit on the vacuum. I took the print off the printer, which came out fine, and then tried the foot on the vacuum, sliding it back and forth, and it seemed to hold in place pretty well. Adding the felt pads was just as easy as before, except I had 2 of them to do per foot instead of 1, but I felt like this was necessary so the plastic part didn't tilt at all and scratch the floor. And now they're all ready to install in the vacuum. And now they're installed in the vacuum, so let's try them out. And this is much better. I don't have to be nearly as careful with how I move the vacuum anymore, and the feet even respond well to tilting it a little bit, which is helpful because I don't always set it down straight. Did you catch that? That was the sound of a lot of air leaking from the sides of the bag chamber. I can feel the air leaking through this area, so I'm suspecting the rubber seal has dried up and is no longer doing its job. To investigate, we will need to take this front plate off. It's just held in by the bag's wing nut and these 4 screws on the outside. After taking those all off, it's pretty easy to remove. When I got inside, the rubber gasket actually looked fine, and it still felt flexible. Maybe it's the design that's flawed, and not the gasket itself. Regardless, we can still attempt to correct that flaw, so I unscrewed the bag from the plate, and then removed it, and then set it to the side. What I'm planning to do is trace the shape of the bag chamber without the front plate. I was hoping to use the suction of the vacuum to hold the paper in place while I did this, but it went about as you'd expect it to. Yeah, so that didn't work. Guess it's just boring old tape. This still worked out pretty well though, and while my tracing was subpar, it looks like it'll be sufficient. This is how it came out when I finished. Next, heading over to SketchUp, I tried to recreate this trace using the scan, along with some measurements I took off camera, and it was pretty challenging to get everything to line up, but I think I got there in the end. I took this over to the laser engraver to cut some tests on paper, just so I can see how it will look, and shockingly, it came out pretty close on the first try, so I knew I was headed in the right direction. After several seemingly identical revisions later, I finally got to cut using foam, and by this point, it fits pretty much perfectly. I'm going to just stick the new foam over the old gasket, since the old one isn't actually bad, it's just not covering all the areas it needs to. My hope is that the foam fills in all those extra gaps. I didn't add any holes to the model because I didn't feel like they were necessary when stabbing the gasket with a pencil works plenty well, but maybe for future gaskets I'll explore this possibility. At this point, it's time to begin reassembly, which is basically the same as taking it apart, it's just backwards. The 4 screws were a little bit tricky to get in because I didn't want them to fall out and cause the gasket to shift, but I got there in the end. Probably the trickiest part of reassembling this vacuum is reinstalling the wing nut that sits at the bottom of the bag chamber, since you need to compress the bag empty assistance spring, or whatever that's called, with one hand. But that got finished too, and we can finally test this. Wow, that sounds a lot better. I'm actually impressed with how that came out. Here's the difference side by side. And that's one other upgrade down. With 3 upgrades, I felt like it was time to try using the vacuum, and it worked pretty well. And after cleaning many of the house's edges with it, I couldn't help but notice how difficult the hose was to use because it's not flexible anymore. And it also leaked quite a bit, which these cloth woven hoses are pretty notorious for. I'm thinking I'll make an adapter so that I can just plug my Electrolux Model G hose into it. Once again, SketchUp being my go-to, I get to designing. This whole part will likely be circular, so it could be turned on a lathe instead, but a 3D print is good for repeatable results. I'm also pretty terrible at using a lathe right now, so maybe with more practice you'll see parts made there instead. Regardless, the part got designed, and it looked pretty promising on the slicer. I printed it on its side to give it more strength, even though printing it vertically would have allowed to print without supports. And it looks like the print came out pretty well, only a little bit of spaghetti on the inside, but that's easily removed. Trying it out on the vacuum, it fits perfectly on the first try. Now to see if the hose fits. And that does too. I tested it out, and it's much easier to use than the original hose. Still, while this is nicer, I wanted this vacuum to have its own hose, so I don't have to steal one off the Model G every time I want to use it. I found this hose on Amazon for about $21 US. It's 10 feet long, and it looks pretty similar to my Model G hose. It didn't fit in the hose adapter I made before, but that's fine. I'll just make a variant of it that's a little bit thicker so the hose fits on it more tightly. The print came out well, and this time no spaghetti. It fit in the vacuum just like before, since I didn't change that part, and the hose fit on nice and snugly. Next thing I need to do is design a clamp that will fit on the outside so the hose can't accidentally get pulled out mid-operation. I struggled with making this design a lot more than I probably should have, but after about an hour of poorly using the software's features, I got something that looks like it'll probably work. And this will print in 2 halves and screw together. The print supports came off really easily. I like when that happens. Looks like my measurement wasn't quite right, as I'm able to squeeze the sides together and it doesn't even compress the hose at all. After bumping the inner diameter down a bit, it's fitting much better now, and it's ready for some screws. The clamp fits loosely around the hose when it isn't tightened, just like it should, so it makes it easy to position it before tightening. Once I'm satisfied with how it's positioned, I tighten the screws and clamp down on the hose. I was a little nervous that the print might break from screwing it too tightly, but it seems like it should work fine. There we go, it holds the hose in place and it doesn't look too bad either. You can also spin it around where it connects to the vacuum, which is necessary so it's easier to untwist if it gets twisted up. For the other side of the hose, I started with an inner insert, so there's something to clamp onto. The next part I designed was the one that the tools would attach to. I've made one of these before, so I already had the measurements, so all I really needed to do was match the base of it with the insert I just made. Once again, I printed it horizontally for extra strength. The last part I needed was something to bring all of it together, and this would be the clamp that would fit around the insert and the part that attaches to the tools. It would also likely be the part that you'd hold onto while using the vacuum. I used the dimensions from the first clamp I made, and I also learned from my past mistakes, so this one's designing went a lot better. I wanted to check on the slicer to see if I could get away with not using supports in the middle, and it's looking like that should work fine. And this made it really easy to remove the little supports that it did need. Now that we have the 4 parts and screws, it's time to try putting everything together. Right away, I noticed that I forgot to make a slot for the insert and the tool connector to fit into, so I went back and made a revision with this part. I double-checked to make sure the tool connector would fit this time, and it looks like we're good to go. Next thing I did was add screws to the clamp, and then I could start pushing other parts through it. It seems like the hose fits in pretty well with the insert, so I think we can safely start tightening everything. And there we go, the hose is finished. Now I can finally try to use this vacuum. Over the course of this video, we've made a new hose to replace the old, stiff, leaky one with ends made specifically to fit this vacuum. A hose adapter to fit other types of hoses, like the one that fits an Electrolux Model G or a Kirby. This is a much cheaper alternative to building an entire hose, and most people with a vacuum like this probably have a couple of these lying around anyway. Feet, for use on hard floors. Why scratch your floors when you can just not do that? And of course, can't forget the bag adapter, to allow the use of HEPA bags alongside the shakeout bag. All these things, in addition to the new gasket, make this vacuum a lot more usable in my opinion. But of course, we couldn't have gotten there if it weren't for the failures along the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.